Blood ties sever quickly when millions are on the line. Siblings laughed when Abigail inherited nothing but a rusted 1920s sewing machine while they claimed grand estates. Their cruel mockery echoed through mahogany walls, completely ignorant that beneath the wooden treadle hid a staggering $221 million fortune. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison Sterling's downtown Boston law office, casting long, weeping shadows across the polished mahogany floor. The atmosphere inside, however, was far colder than the autumn storm brewing over the harbor. 3 siblings sat in high-backed leather chairs, forming a tense triangle of grief, greed, and silent judgment. At the head of the arrangement sat Richard Montgomery, a man whose tailored Italian suits and leased Aston Martin desperately masked the crumbling state of his venture capital firm. To his right was Chloe, tapping a French manicured fingernail impatiently against her limited edition Birkin bag, her eyes hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses despite the gloom indoors. And then there was Abigail. Sitting slightly apart from her older siblings, Abigail clutched a damp tissue in her lap. She wore a simple navy cardigan and practical boots, her unstyled hair damp from the rain. While Richard and Chloe had spent the last 2 weeks since grandmother Beatrice's funeral aggressively cataloguing the Montgomery family assets, Abigail had spent it mourning. Beatrice Montgomery, known to the family as Nana Bea, had been a woman of contradictions. She was the widow of a shipping magnate, yet she stubbornly lived in a modest carriage house, baked her own bread, and mended her own clothes. To Richard and Chloe, she was an eccentric miser, holding out on their rightful inheritance. To Abigail, she was the only genuine warmth in a fiercely cold family. Harrison Sterling, a stoic lawyer in his late 60s, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the 3 heirs with a gaze that suggested he had seen this exact tragedy play out 100 times before. "Let us proceed," Sterling announced, his voice dry like old parchment. "We are here for the final reading and execution of the last will and testament of Beatrice Eleanor Montgomery." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let's get straight to the brass tacks, Harrison. We all know the estate is worth tens of millions. The properties, the stock portfolios, the offshore accounts." "Patience, Richard," Sterling reprimanded mildly, unsealing the thick manila envelope on his desk. He withdrew a few sheets of heavy, cream-colored paper. Beatrice was highly specific about the division of her remaining assets. Sterling began to read. The preamble was standard legal boilerplate, but as he reached the dispensations, the room grew suffocatingly quiet. "To my eldest grandson, Richard," Sterling read, raising his voice slightly. "I leave the entirety of the Montgomery Manor in Connecticut, alongside the surrounding 40 acres of land." Richard let out a sharp, triumphant exhale, sinking back into his chair. Montgomery Manor was a legendary Gilded Age estate. He was already doing the mental math on how quickly he could liquidate the land to save his failing startup. "To my granddaughter Chloe," Sterling continued, "I leave the contents of my personal safety deposit box at First Fidelity Bank, which contains the complete Montgomery family jewel collection, including the sapphire parure and the diamond tiara." Chloe gasped, a genuine smile finally breaking through her stoic socialite facade. "Oh, thank God. I thought the old bat sold them." Abigail flinched at the disrespect, but remained silent. She braced herself. She didn't want money. She just wanted a memento. A photograph, perhaps, or Beatrice's beloved collection of pressed flowers. Sterling paused. He looked down at the paper, then up at Abigail. There was a flicker of something completely unreadable in his eyes. Pity, perhaps, or deep amusement. "And to my youngest granddaughter, Abigail," Sterling read softly, "who was the only one to understand the value of mending what is broken rather than throwing it away. I leave my 1928 Singer treadle sewing machine, including its original oak cabinet and all contents within. The silence that followed was absolute. Then a low chuckle erupted from Richard's chest. It quickly escalated into full-blown, barking laughter. Chloe joined in, her high-pitched giggles echoing off the glass walls. "A sewing machine," Richard wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "Abby, you hit the jackpot. A rusted piece of junk from the Depression era. What are you going to do? Open a sweatshop in your studio apartment?" Chloe smirked, adjusting her designer sunglasses. "It's fitting, really. You always did dress like a peasant, Abigail. Now you can stitch your own potato sacks." "That is enough," Sterling warned, though his tone lacked real authority. Abigail felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck, but she forced her chin up. "I'll gladly take it. Nana B and I spent hundreds of hours at that machine. She taught me how to quilt on it. It means more to me than a dusty old house." Richard sneered, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, little sister. I have a real estate broker to call. I'm going to bulldoze that manor and turn it into luxury condos." As the siblings haughtily exited the office, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and disdain in their wake, Sterling handed Abigail a small piece of paper. It was a warehouse receipt. "The machine is heavy, Abigail," Sterling said quietly. "You will need a truck to move it. Beatrice insisted it not be touched by anyone but you." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Abigail whispered, folding the paper. She walked out into the pouring rain, oblivious to the fact that her siblings' seemingly glorious inheritances were poisoned chalices. Richard didn't yet know that Montgomery Manor carried 3 decades of unpaid, heavily penalized property taxes and severe structural rot that made it legally unsellable. Chloe didn't yet know that their grandfather had secretly pawned the real jewels in 1982 to cover gambling debts, replacing the legendary sapphires and diamonds with expertly crafted, completely worthless paste. Abigail only knew she had her grandmother's memory, and a very, very heavy piece of iron. It took 2 days, a rented box truck, and a sympathetic neighbor to get the massive 1928 Singer sewing machine into Abigail's cramped, 4th-floor walk-up apartment. It now sat in the corner of her tiny living room, taking up 1/3 of the usable space. The machine was housed in a rich, dark oak cabinet that had seen better days. The cast-iron treadle pedal at the base was seized with rust, and the black enamel of the sewing head, once adorned with intricate gold leaf decals, was chipped and dull. Abigail sat on her worn sofa, staring at it. She had exactly $84 in her checking account. Her job as a substitute teacher barely covered her rent, and the cost of renting the truck had eaten her grocery budget for the week. For a fleeting, desperate moment, she wondered if she could sell the antique to a collector for a few $100s. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "Nana Bear gave it to me." Deciding to honor the gift, Abigail bought a cheap bottle of mineral oil and a set of microfiber cloths. She spent her Saturday afternoon carefully wiping down the wooden cabinet. As she rubbed the oil into the dry oak, the wood drank it in, revealing deep, beautiful grains that had been hidden under decades of dust. She opened the top lid and pulled the heavy iron machine head up on its hinges, locking it into place. She wiped down the gold leaf Egyptian motifs. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. But as Abigail reached underneath the table to wipe the wooden casing that housed the machine's base compartment, something felt wrong. She knocked her knuckles against the bottom of the wooden base. Thud. It didn't sound hollow. It sounded completely solid, like knocking on a cinder block. Abigail frowned. She had helped her grandmother clean this machine dozens of times when she was a teenager. The base compartment was supposed to be a hollow wooden drop box where the machine head rested when folded away. It shouldn't be this heavy. In fact, when she and her neighbor had carried the cabinet upstairs, the neighbor had sworn profusely, claiming it felt like it was filled with lead. Grabbing a flashlight from her kitchen drawer, Abigail lay on her back on the cheap rug and shined the beam underneath the sewing table. The bottom of the wooden compartment was flush, but the wood grain didn't quite match the sides. It was a false bottom. She ran her fingers along the dusty inner rim. Near the back right corner, hidden entirely by the iron framework of the treadle wheel, her fingernail caught on a tiny, almost microscopic groove in the wood. She pressed it. Nothing happened. She slid it to the left. Click. A metallic spring mechanism snapped loudly in the quiet apartment. Abigail scrambled backward, just as the entire bottom panel of the wooden compartment swung down on a hidden hinge. A heavy rectangular object fell out, landing on the carpet with a muffled thud. Abigail sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lying on her floor was a dull grey, fireproof metal lockbox. It was incredibly heavy, measuring about 12 by 8 inches. The lock was an old-fashioned brass keyhole. "All contents within," Abigail breathed, recalling the exact phrasing of the will. She frantically searched the drawers of the sewing cabinet. Thimbles, spools of vintage thread, a rusty pair of shears, and finally, tucked inside a hollowed-out wooden pincushion, a heavy brass key. With trembling hands, Abigail inserted the key into the lockbox. It turned with a satisfying, well-oiled click. She lifted the heavy lid. There were no stacks of cash, no gold bars. Instead, there was a worn, red, leather-bound diary, a thick stack of pristine, yellowed documents covered in ornate financial watermarks, and a strange, silver key stamped with a Swiss cross. Abigail pulled out the documents. They were share certificates, but they weren't for standard companies. They were original, founder-level bearer shares for a small, obscure medical technology startup incorporated in 1974. Pinned to the front of the stack was a handwritten note in Beatrice's elegant, looping cursive. "My dearest Abby, if you are reading this, your siblings' greed has blinded them, just as I knew it would. They only see the surface. They only want the immediate shine. 40 years ago, a young engineer rented a room in my carriage house. He couldn't pay rent, so he gave me these shares in his new company instead. I forgot about them for a decade, until the company went public. Then I watched them split and split and split again. I hid them here, because the men in our family have a habit of squandering fortunes. This fortune is yours. Use it to mend the world, my sweet girl." Abigail blinked tears from her eyes. She recognized the name of the company on the certificates. It wasn't obscure anymore. It was currently one of the largest multinational biomedical conglomerates on the planet. Monday morning, Abigail didn't go to work. Instead, she put on her best blazer, placed the documents in a secure leather portfolio, and took a cab to the financial district. She bypassed the retail banks and went straight to the offices of Arthur Pendleton, an elite forensic accountant and wealth manager who had occasionally lectured at her university. Arthur, a meticulous man with sharp features and a perfectly tailored grey suit, looked highly skeptical as the casually dressed Abigail was ushered into his office. But the moment she placed the vintage bearer shares on his glass desk, his demeanor shifted entirely. He put on a pair of white cotton gloves and examined the watermarks under a high-powered loupe. The silence in the office stretched for 10 agonizing minutes. "Miss Montgomery," Arthur finally said, his voice completely devoid of its former arrogance. He looked up, his eyes wide. "Are you aware of what these are?" "They're shares," Abigail said nervously. "Nana Bayer said they split a few times." "A few times is a drastic understatement," Arthur breathed, pulling up a complex financial terminal on his computer monitors. These are uncashed bearer shares. They are essentially equivalent to holding physical cash, but tied to equity. This company underwent a 10-for-1 split in the 80s, a 5-for-1 in the 90s, and merged with a global pharmaceutical giant in 2008. These original shares entitle the bearer to the accumulated, reinvested dividends of the past 40 years. Arthur's fingers flew across his keyboard. He hit enter, and a number flashed in green across his screen. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Miss Montgomery, assuming these clear the standard authentication process, and given the accompanying documentation and the Swiss trust key you've shown me, I have no doubt they will. The current liquid value of this portfolio," he paused, swallowing hard, "is $221,460,000. The room spun. Abigail gripped the arms of her chair. $221 million? She choked out. Tax-free, as it is held in a grandfathered bearer trust, Arthur confirmed, looking at her as if she had just materialized from thin air. You are quite literally one of the wealthiest women in New England. Just as the reality of the astronomical number began to crash over her, Abigail's cheap cell phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She pulled it out. It was a group FaceTime call from Richard and Chloe. Still in a daze, Abigail tapped accept. Richard's face appeared on the screen, red and furious. He was standing in front of Montgomery Manor, but it looked worse than a haunted house. The roof was caving in, and there were bright yellow condemned signs taped to the grand front doors. "Abigail!" Richard shouted through the phone's tinny speaker. "The city is hitting me with a $2 million tax lien. They won't let me sell the land until I clear the debt. You have to take out a loan against your salary to help me." Before she could answer, Chloe's tear-streaked face popped into the split-screen frame. She was standing in a pawn shop. "He's lying, Abby. Help me first. The jeweler laughed at me. The diamonds are fake. They're all fake. I already charged $100,000 in designer clothes on credit, assuming I was rich." Abigail sat in the silence of Arthur Pendleton's high-rise office. She looked at the frantic, greedy faces of the siblings who had mocked her only a week ago. She looked down at the $221 million fortune resting quietly on the glass desk. She took a slow, deep breath, finally feeling the incredible, unyielding weight of her inheritance. Abigail stared at the split screen of her phone, the frantic, demanding voices of Richard and Chloe echoing in the pristine silence of Arthur Pendleton's office. A week ago, she would have scrambled to help them. She would have drained her meager savings to keep Richard out of legal trouble or offered Chloe a place to sleep. Instead, she simply pressed the red end call button. The silence rushed back in, thick and absolute. Abigail placed the phone face down on the glass desk, her hands finally steady. She looked at Arthur, who was watching her with a mixture of professional detachment and profound respect. "Mr. Pendleton," Abigail said, her voice surprisingly firm, "how quickly can we secure these assets into a blind trust?" Given the bearer nature of the shares and the authentication from the Swiss depository, I can have an emergency bridge account open with J.P. Morgan Chase Private Bank by close of business today, Arthur replied, already reaching for his encrypted landline. The full transfer and liquidation schedule will take a few weeks to optimize for tax mitigation, but you will have access to an 8-figure line of credit within 24 hours. While Abigail quietly orchestrated the birth of her new life, Richard and Chloe's worlds were violently detonating. Richard Montgomery sat in his leased corner office, staring at a foreclosure notice. The situation at Montgomery Manor was far worse than he had admitted on the FaceTime call. The estate wasn't just heavily taxed, it was the center of an EPA investigation due to illegal chemical dumping by a previous tenant Their grandfather had rented to in the 90s. The cleanup costs were estimated at $5 million. When his venture capital investors caught wind of his personal financial catastrophe, they triggered a morality clause in his contract, voting to oust him from his own firm. Across town, Chloe was experiencing a similar freefall. The high society jeweler had not only confiscated the fake paste diamonds, claiming they were evidence of attempted fraud, but news of the forgery had leaked to the Boston socialite columns. Her wealthy fiancé, a hedge fund manager who valued his public image above all else, broke off their engagement via a text message. Chloe was left with a mountain of credit card debt from her premature shopping spree and an eviction notice on her luxury penthouse. Desperation breeds audacity. With their backs against the wall, Richard and Chloe met at a dingy diner, a far cry from their usual Michelin-starred haunts. She hung up on me, Richard snarled, stirring a cheap black coffee. Abigail completely ignored my calls. "Mine too," Chloe hissed, her designer sunglasses failing to hide her bloodshot eyes. "She's probably sitting in that pathetic apartment, gloating." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Think about it, Chloe. Why would the old bat leave Abigail a useless sewing machine with such specific wording in the will? All contents within." I had my lawyer, Donovan Pierce, look into it. He deals with estate disputes. Pierce thinks Nana Bay might have hidden cash in that wooden cabinet. Maybe a few $100,000. She was paranoid about banks. Chloe's eyes widened with greedy desperation. If there's cash in there, it belongs to the estate. It belongs to us. Exactly. Richard smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. We're going to sue her for it. We'll claim undue influence. We'll say Abigail manipulated a senile old woman into giving her the only liquid asset left. We need that machine, Chloe. It's our only way out. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere in the arbitration conference room was suffocating. Richard and Chloe sat on one side of a long, polished oak table, flanked by Donovan Pierce, a shark-like litigator known for tearing apart families for a percentage of the settlement. They looked ragged. Richard's suit was unpressed, and Chloe's manicured nails were bitten down to the quick. The door opened, and Abigail walked in. She wasn't wearing potato sacks, nor was she dripping in designer logos. She wore a tailored, understated charcoal suit, projecting a quiet, unshakable authority. Behind her walked Arthur Pendleton and a team of 3 formidable corporate attorneys from a top-tier firm. Richard balked, his eyes darting to Abigail's high-powered legal team. "What is this, Abby? How are you paying for them?" "Let's get straight to the point, Richard," Abigail said, taking her seat. She didn't look angry, she just looked deeply tired of them. Donovan Pierce cleared his throat, puffing out his chest. "Miss Montgomery, my clients are prepared to file a massive lawsuit contesting the will of Beatrice Montgomery. We have reason to believe the antique sewing machine you inherited contains undisclosed cash assets that rightfully belong in a 3-way split. However, to save you the financial ruin of a lengthy legal battle, they are willing to settle." "Oh?" Abigail raised an eyebrow. "And what are their terms?" Richard leaned forward, slamming his hands on the table. "You give us the sewing machine, Abigail, all of it. In exchange, we won't drag your name through the mud in probate court. It's a generous offer. You keep your pathetic little life, and we take what's ours." Arthur Pendleton leaned over and whispered something in Abigail's ear. She nodded slowly. "I have a counteroffer," Abigail said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. She slid a thick, legally binding document across the table. "I am well aware of your financial situations. Richard, you are facing a $5 million EPA cleanup and personal bankruptcy. Chloe, You are nearly $500,000 in debt to various creditors. Chloe flinched, looking away. If you sign this document, Abigail continued, I will personally pay off the EPA lien on Montgomery Manor, completely clearing the title so you can sell it, Richard. And I will pay off every single one of Chloe's debts. Richard's jaw dropped. Donovan Pierce snatched the document, his eyes scanning the legalese. What's the catch? Richard demanded, his voice shaking. The catch, Abigail said coldly, is the ironclad waiver attached. By accepting this financial bailout, you permanently and irrevocably forfeit any and all future claims to the estate of Beatrice Montgomery, the sewing machine, and its contents. You walk away free of debt, but you walk away forever. Richard and Chloe looked at each other. $5.5 million in immediate debt relief. It was a lifeline. It was salvation. They assumed Abigail had taken out a massive, foolish loan just to keep the antique machine out of sentimentality. She's an idiot, Richard whispered to Chloe. Sign it before she changes her mind. Feverishly, Richard and Chloe snatched the pens provided and scrawled their signatures across the dotted lines, legally severing themselves from their grandmother's legacy for good. Donovan Pierce slid the signed documents back across the table. A pleasure doing business with you, Miss Montgomery. Though I must admit, ruining yourself for a piece of rusted iron is quite the choice. Abigail carefully placed the signed waivers into her leather portfolio. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She looked at her older brother and sister, pity finally replacing the years of resentment. You always thought Nana Bay was just a stingy old woman, Abigail said softly, standing up. You never bothered to look deeper. You never bothered to see the value in things that weren't immediately shiny. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, opening his briefcase. For the record, Mr. Pierce, my client is not ruining herself. The debts of your clients will be paid from the Beatrice Montgomery Philanthropic Trust. Richard frowned. What trust? Arthur pulled out a glossy financial prospectus and laid it on the table. The cover read, The Beatrice Montgomery Philanthropic Trust, initial endowment, $221,460,000. The contents of the sewing machine base, Arthur stated matter-of-factly, adjusting his cuffs, contained original bearer shares from a major biomedical conglomerate. Miss Montgomery is now the sole controller of a $221 million fortune. The color drained from Richard's face so fast he looked like a corpse. Chloe let out a strangled, breathless gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. 200, Richard stammered, his eyes bulging as he stared at the prospectus. No, that's impossible. That's ours. We split it. That's family money. Not anymore, Abigail said, her voice ringing with absolute finality. She tapped the signed waivers. You just sold your shares in a $200 million fortune for a fraction of the cost, just to clean up your own messes. You got exactly what you asked for. As Richard collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, and Chloe began to sob hysterically, Abigail turned and walked out of the conference room. She stepped out into the bright Boston sunlight, breathing in the crisp air. She had a world to mend, and finally, she had the thread to do it. Blood ties are often the first to sever when greed takes root, but true wealth lies in the wisdom to mend what is broken. Abigail transformed a rusty heirloom into a legacy of healing, leaving her siblings to choke on the bitter ashes of their own arrogance. The old treadle machine now sits in a pristine charitable foundation lobby, a quiet monument to a $200 million lesson in humility.